next, a live viewer call-in program. We are joined by David MacMichael, Washington Director of the Association of National Security Alumni, a group which is opposed to the use of covert action in intelligence gathering. He will take your calls to discuss the operations of the CIA and the intelligence community.
David MacMichael, the Washington Director of the Association of National Security Alumni. In today's political climate, what do you think the responsibilities of the CIA should be?
Well, the responsibilities of the CIA should be those still laid out basically in the National Security Act of 1947, and that is to collate, analyze the intelligence information, and provide the final evaluation of this to the decision makers, particularly the President of the United States.
As a former employee of the agency yourself, how do you think the CIA has changed the way it's doing business today?
Well, one thing is that the CIA has been greatly, let us say, weakened vis-a-vis the Department of Defense over the last few years. I think it's also having to overcome considerable embarrassment for what are perceived as major intelligence failures, and of course still battling the Iran-Contra scandal.
One of the issues that seems to come up in a lot of articles that have been written over the last couple of months is a so-called turf battle between the CIA and the Defense Department. Explain that.
Well, it has to do, in one level, with the vexed affair of so-called covert operations. And this really gets to be a constitutional matter. The President of the United States, as you know, and especially this one, Mr. Bush, has been very intolerant of what he regards as congressional intrusion into his area of responsibility in the conduct of foreign policy and in covert operations, covert actions. And I think the temptation to rely upon the constitutionally based commander-in-chief authority to go directly through the armed forces rather than through the legislatively created intelligence community is almost overwhelming at this time, and there's much chapter and verse on this in various presidential messages.
Before we get our first call, some background information, if you could give us on the CIA. What kind of authority does it have?
Well, the CIA's authority, very interestingly, has been limited to one piece of legislation going back to 1947, and an enormous amount, I think, by the General Accounting Office's, the Congressional Research Service's account of the last 2 years ago, basically has relied on executive orders, some 1,200 of them, as a matter of fact.
But as our viewers can see with the graphic now on the screen, no powers to arrest and no powers of prosecution?
That's correct. This was a major concern of the Congress when the proposal for a Central Intelligence Agency was created. Of course, it was a major concern of the late J. Edgar Hoover as well.
Good afternoon from Washington. Our guest is David MacMichael, who is the Washington Director of the Association of National Security Alumni. We will be taking your calls in just about a minute or so. You'll see the number on the bottom of your screen for you folks living here in the East Coast or Midwest. The number is 202-628-2525. And for our viewers on the West Coast, the number is 202-783-2727. As we continue our special programming this afternoon in preparation for tomorrow's confirmation hearings of Robert Gates to head the CIA. Have you ever met Bob Gates?
Oh, yes, I met Mr. Gates.
When?
Oh, when I was working in the agency in 1980s, early 1980s, and I will not claim a friendship or familiarity with him. Let's just say I've met him, and he's a very pleasant fellow.
Any impression at all that stands out?
The only impression I ever took away from my personal contact with Mr. Gates, let me say that he was, in fact, a very, not exactly hail fellow, well met, but certainly an open and frank and a friendly person, yes.
Let me read you a quote from this morning's New York Times. It refers to Richard Kerr, who is, of course, the acting director of the agency at the moment. And he says that until Mr. Gates or another candidate is permanently confirmed for the job, He says that the whole issue of the Iran-Contra affair troubles him because he, according to this article, told Bob Gates about the Iran-Contra affair in August 1986, more than a month before Mr. Gates has publicly said he first heard about that, bringing up the whole issue of credibility. Your response to that particular incident?
Well, it means that Mr. Gates, who had to field many of these same types of questions and the lack of credibility during his hearings in 1987 when he was first nominated, is going to have to face them again, and this time much more strongly because people within the agency, like Richard Carr, are coming forward with their recollection of the chronology.
What are you looking for this week?
I'm looking for a very hard-hitting affair in which the contest will be between some Democrats on the committee who wish to use the Gates nomination to reopen the Iran-Contra affair, and with Republican members who wish to use it to quiet the whole thing down. And part of this goes toward protection of the president. Part of this goes toward protection of the president. Charges and rumors abound as to George Bush's involvement in those years, and it's most important to the administration to say these were handled finally in these hearings and found not worthy of consideration and put down.
First caller from New York City. Go ahead, please.
It seems to me that we owe a great debt of gratitude to the CIA's actions the post-World War II period, helping to preserve our freedom. Specifically, recently the Russian foreign minister has acknowledged that Ronald Reagan was right, and that the Soviet Union really was the evil empire throughout that period. And my question is, as an expert on intelligent matters, do you think as we have a little bit more openness now within the Soviet Union, that some of the information as far as the KGB's involvement in the attempted assassination of the Pope or in the assassination of President Kennedy will be divulged, or do you think that's information that will be buried deep forever?
Well, caller, I can tell you that one of the great growth industries in Europe over the next year or two is going to be the purveying of hot stuff information allegedly from the secret files of the KGB. But in regard to the overall question, yes, I'd welcome a lot more openness on all sides in the handling of so-called secret information.
What is the National Association of Security Alumni?
The Association of National Security Alumni are a group of former CIA officers, FBI agents. We have one or two members from the Drug Enforcement Administration whose general position is in calling for more openness in the handling of so-called classified information and secrecy, and particularly to oppose the use of covert actions to implement foreign policy.
We have another caller on the line. Where are you calling from?
Miami, Florida.
Go ahead,
Good evening,
please.
gentlemen.
Good evening.
If I understand correctly, what you seem to be advocating is doing away with covert CIA operations. That may work good in areas of democracy or glasnost, but what would we do, for instance, in China to get information, or Iraq in the future, places like that? But I do want to make one comment. I don't believe any president should have a CIA force to operate in the name of the American people. I believe it should be brought under accountability of, if not the entire Congress, because I realize there are leaks, but the Committee for Intelligence.
Okay, the quick answer to your question is that what you described is the clandestine or secret gathering of information is not covert action. Covert action, by definition, and has just been defined in law for the first time. These are activities of the United States government influence political, economic, or military conditions abroad, where it is intended the role of the United States government will not be apparent or acknowledged publicly. These are interventions in politics, in economic affairs, and sometimes include paramilitary or military actions.
Dave MacMichael was born in Albany, New York in 1928, served in the U.S. Marine Corps from 1946 until 1959. Good evening. Where are you calling from?
Los Angeles.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like Mr. MacMichael, please, to comment on the Danny Casolaro alleged suicide, and also on some of the investigative work that Casolaro was doing, which I know he knows about, connections between BCCI, INSLAW, October Surprise, and Iran-Contra. And there is a lot of evidence, or at least, connections that can be made between all those four events in particular. And if you'd please comment, I'd appreciate it.
Before commenting, maybe you should clarify who Danny Casolaro
That's
was.
very quickly, and this covers a great deal of universe. Danny Casolaro is an author and researcher who was pursuing a number of sources into the clandestine world, and was found dead in a hotel room in West Virginia something over 3 weeks ago. There's a great deal of controversy. His family does not believe that Mr. Casolaro, in fact, killed himself, and there is speculation that he was getting, as they say, too close to important information. As a matter of fact, Mr. Casolaro called me the day he left for his final trip to West Virginia, and said he almost had it wrapped up. He knew what he was going to write about. So, yes, he was and had taken a great deal of notes on such things as BCCI, the INSLAW case, and others, but the specifics beyond that, I can't go because I don't know.
Do you have any gut feeling on the whole case?
Oh, boy, I've learned to distrust gut feelings on this sort of thing. I can only say that Mr. Casolaro's family and most people who've dealt with him do not believe it, and that he committed suicide. And I will also say that if, in fact, my strong belief is that if it were not death by his own hand, this had something to do with the INSLAW case, and we really don't have time, I think, to get into the details of that.
We have about 35 more minutes with Dave MacMichael. Our next caller is from New York City. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Mr. MacMichael. I want to thank you for being so straightforward. And I wanted to ask you also about the INSLAW case. However, you just said that you can't get into that now. What I would also like to know is what your opinion or feeling is with regard to Robert Gates's knowledge of the Iran-Contra affair and any of the other previously noted allegations.
Thank you.
Well, this, of course, is going to be the focus of Mr. Gates' interrogation. Now, he was weighed in the balance once in 1987 and found wanting in terms of credibility. And it's hard for me to believe that the passage of 3.5 years is going to make him that much more credible, especially against the background of the indictments of the indictment of Claire George and the guilty plea of Alan Fires. Frankly, what Mr. Gates faces is the situation is this. It's very clear from Judge Walsh's investigation that there was a widespread pattern of lying by CIA officers to the Congressional Investigating Committees and to the independent counsel's investigators themselves during the very period when Mr. Gates was acting director of the CIA following William Casey's death. And if he were aware of that, of course, Mr. Gates himself should be indicted. If he were aware of that and did not reveal it or take any steps to do anything about it, he should also be indicted. And if this pattern was so widespread as it appears to be, Mr. Walsh has about 50 current and former agents whom he could charge with perjury, why then one would have to question his administrative ability and wonder if he is capable of running the CIA.
What will you be doing this week?
I'll be following this as part of the Pacifica Radio team at the hearings. It's just subject of great interest to me.
And, of course, C-SPAN will have live gavel-to-gavel coverage beginning tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. Our coverage, though, will begin at 7 a.m. with more of your calls on the confirmation hearings of Robert Gates. Our next caller from Seattle, Washington. Good afternoon.
Well, thank you. This is in the congressional record of June 22nd of 1987, so this has been substantiated fully. The CIA uncovered in the investigation of communist terrorist activities in Central America. They uncovered letters from Pat Schroeder, Urban Daimler, John Conyers, that were requesting information and monies to support this government that was not recognized by our government. Why isn't there an investigation on this? These are facts. These are not suppositions.
Well, I don't know what government you're referring to that was not recognized by the United States in the year that you describe. If you mean Nicaragua, of course, Nicaraguan government, the Sandinista government, if you will, was a recognized government. We exchanged ambassadors. The embassies were open in both countries. What the problem is, I don't really know.
Elton, Maryland. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I was kind of interested in whether or not there's much rivalry between the CIA and the FBI in their overseas operations.
Well, technically speaking, the FBI's overseas operations are very limited. We have at many embassies there will be a what we call a legal liaison officer who will usually be an FBI agent whose business is to follow up in foreign countries matters of interest domestically to the FBI. Historically, of course, Mr. Hoover, at the time of the creation of the CIA, was terribly opposed to giving any form of police or surveillance or any domestic powers at all to the new CIA, and in fact was less than completely cooperative with it for a very long time. But and I can tell you right now, a matter that Mr. Colby referred to during his talk here about the paralysis which he talked about in getting Soviet agents for some years. This was, while he did not say so, this was due to the activities of I would say, almost certifiably insane James Angleton while he was head of counterintelligence for the CIA. And, of course, this totally disrupted, his activities totally disrupted not only CIA activities, but a very great disruption of FBI activities, and the FBI simply broke off relations for some time because of that.
Some additional background information on our guest. David MacMichael, as I said earlier, was born in Albany, New York, graduate of Hampton-Sydney College, Phi Beta Kappa, and also earned your master's and PhD at the University of Oregon. He's also the editor of Unclassified, which is your newsletter.
Yes.
How many people receive that?
Oh, we have a paid subscription list now of almost 700 people, and we certainly hope to expand that.
Hollywood, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good afternoon, gentlemen. Three-part question I have for you today. First question, your familiarity and comments with the MK Ultra program, and also on that question, to what extent does the CIA still have links, or are they investigating mind control type activities as they were during that MK Ultra program? The second question...
Why don't you stay? We'll try to take each one at a time. If we can, we'll go with the first one.
Okay, MK Ultra, to which the caller refers, and we certainly hope to expand that.
Hollywood, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good afternoon, gentlemen. Three-part question I have for you today. First question, your familiarity and comments with the MK Ultra program, and also on that question, to what extent does the CIA still have links, or are they investigating mind control type activities as they were during that MK Ultra program? The second question...
Why don't you stay? We'll try to take each one at a time. If we can, we'll go with the first one.
Okay, MK Ultra, to which the caller refers, was a program started by then Deputy Director for Operations Richard Helms in 1953 to experiment with the use of hallucinogens, particularly LSD, and other, let's say, bizarre psychiatric methods to get at what was then believed to be the communist secrets of brainwashing, which of course did not exist. There's an excellent book on this, by the way, called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate by John Marks. More important, though, and I think this gets directly at the CIA aspect of this, is these experiments were carried on through a CIA front called the Institute for the Study of Human Ecology, which had been established at Cornell University Medical School, and then funded these activities, which were unwitting experiments on at least 9 Canadian citizens over a period of years at the Allen Memorial Institute in Canada, which resulted in severe mental and physical damage. I mean, these things were just very bad. A lawsuit was filed in 1973, Orlikow versus the United States, which was finally settled out of court after 15 years of litigation. And this is a scandal. I really want to say this. This is a genuine scandal involving the CIA, because throughout the course of this trial, the CIA and the United States government generally stonewalled on this. The evidence was very plain. and none of those involved, including the chief psychologist of the CIA, in various depositions expressed the least regret for this. The case finally had to be settled out of court, very limited settlements for the victims, because they were old and about to die, many of them. One had, as a matter of fact, during the course of the litigation. This is always going to be a very severe stain on the reputation of the CIA and the United States government entirely. I really mean that.
Caller, you had a follow-up.
Yes, I have a second question. Given, again, such unscrupulous activity in the past, what are your comments regarding the connection between George Bush, who was CIA director in 1976, and paid informants such as President Manuel Noriega of Panama? And did the CIA, in fact, help to bring drugs or allow drugs to flow into this country?
My stock answer to that is to say that in my experience, which is not extensive in this, but I have some, is that so-called covert operations on any scale and drug trafficking go together like dogs and fleas. I can recommend to you a recent book by Peter Dale Scott and Jonathan Marshall called Cocaine Politics, dealing with this, which former DEA as Drug Enforcement Agency officer Mike Levine, who is very critical of CIA involvement with drugs overseas, called the most important book on the subject that anyone can possibly read.
This is an article in the Washington Times by syndicated columnist Cord Meyer, the headline, Revising Clandestine Priorities. What are they revising?
Well, in this case, interestingly, the priorities now are supposed to go on to matters such as drugs, on to matters such as terrorism, and a particular favorite of the recently retired Judge Webster, economic intelligence. Several people have referred to this as, critics, let me say, of the CIA as desperately casting about for missions simply to stay in business.
Try to get more calls. We have about a half hour left with David MacMichael, our next caller. Where are you calling from?
Portland, Oregon.
Yes, go ahead, please.
My question is very straightforward. What explanation can you, Mr. MacMichael, offer for why Americans are no good at what is called HUMINT, or human intelligence? We can't put people on the ground. We can't generate people who can just go out, to a restaurant and talk to a source and come back with information that would tell us whether or not that baby milk factory in Baghdad really was a baby milk factory or not. We got to hear it from Peter Arnett. Americans, or the kinds of Americans that go into your business, just seem to be no good. If they learn a language, they want to become an aficionado of the place.
Well, this is voicing a lot of criticism. One does hear about CIA activities in the plain old-fashioned business of espionage, and there have been very, very significant intelligence failures. One of them, of course, being in the case of Iraq. And why didn't we have more agents on the ground and more officers on the ground? What were the priorities given there? These are questions to which I frankly don't know the answer. But I can also tell you that this matter is being addressed, but Mr. Colby also referred to this. We have an enormous take now from technology, the satellites, the listening devices, and so forth, and there is some question as to what in fact is the value as compared to the risk of attempting to place large numbers of case officers out there, attracting ever larger numbers of agents to work for you. The whole business of trying to gather as against capabilities what are people's intentions is a very difficult one. Most recently, as you mentioned, in the case of Iraq, it was President Bush himself who dismissed the probability analysis presented by the Mideast experts in both defense intelligence and the CIA that Iraq probably would attack on the ground, and this is HUMINT, his recent conversations with Hosni Mubarak of Egypt and King Hussein of Jordan.
We'll come back to that issue, but our next caller from Rochester, New Hampshire. Go ahead.
Yes, hello. I'd like to direct a question to Mr. MacMichael. The press has had a lot about how the CIA has had public accountability through having to report to the Senate and all that. What I haven't seen is how is the NSA publicly accountable? Is it publicly accountable?
No, as a matter of fact, the NSA is not accountable except to the extent that its budget is a portion of the intelligence authorization, which is worked on every year. The NSA, of course, is not an organization which does anything or should not be doing anything much beyond collection. In other words, priorities are given to the NSA as to what things to be listening for in what areas of the world, and the take from that enormous effort is piled up on the unhappy analysts at Langley and in the Defense Department.
This is what the newsletter looks like. It's called Unclassified. You mentioned earlier about the Iraqi invasion into Kuwait. What do you think we learned from that whole incident?
Well, the Iraqi invasion into Kuwait, I think the information is fairly clear that the Iraqi forces had pulled up into a situation in which they could attack. The question became, would they attack? I think one of the most important lessons learned, if indeed it was learned, goes back to decisions made 7 years earlier, in fact, during the Iran-Iraq War, when the United States made its tilt toward Iraq in meetings in Baghdad by high U.S. intelligence officials, as I am informed. And at that point, we, as a former high-ranking National Security Council officer, Howard Teicher, said in an interview in the Washington Post some months ago, said we were so busy giving intelligence to Iraq, we didn't spend any time gathering intelligence about Iraq. And perhaps that is, if there's a lesson to be learned there, it's that you are as assiduous in these instances in collecting intelligence information on those you consider your friends at this time as you are against those you consider your enemies.
Next caller from Minnesota. Go ahead, please.
Yes, it was mentioned earlier that Mr. MacMichael believes that there should be intelligence gathering without covert operations. How is that possible?
Well, I thought I'd explain that because covert action, covert operations have a particular definition. These are actions undertaken by the United States government to influence political, economic, or social results in another country in which the participation of the United States is to be concealed or, if revealed, plausibly denied. These are positive actions. These are the things like fixing elections, for example, or sabotaging the harvest. All things that have been done, by the way. The covert gathering of information is not considered covert action. The reason there is a difference is because in order for the intelligence community to carry out a covert action, there has to be a presidential finding which determines under the new law that such action is necessary for the national security and to achieve a definable United States foreign policy objective. And that finding has to be presented to the Congress, to the congressional oversight committees, the committees in the Senate and the House. They cannot prohibit these, but they must be informed about them. So there's a real difference here, and I hope that answers your question.
Eugene, Oregon. Go ahead, please.
This is Fairbanks Alaska. You talking to me?
Sorry about that, but go ahead, Fairbanks. Glad you're on the line. Yes.
Okay-do. Mr. MacMichael, would you comment on allegations made in a well-documented book by Mr. Stephen Mumford? The book is America, Democracy, and the Vatican, Population Growth and National Security, put out by the Humanist Press. And the allegation is that the CIA is dominated by Roman Catholics.
Well, certainly there have been Roman Catholic directors of the Central Intelligence Agency, John McCone for one, but I don't think one could, buy that. There have been other allegations at various times that the CIA was controlled by WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or laterally by Mormons. So you take your pick. I will say this with regard to the comment, however. In various parts of the world at various times, such as Italy in the immediate post-war World War II era, or in Latin America up until a very recent period, it has been a tendency for the United States government to regard conservative elements within the Roman Catholic Church as allies in the United States policy, and therefore our intelligence agencies have, in one way or another, attempted to use sources within there or to work on sometimes covert actions there. But I don't think I could endorse your statement that the CIA is dominated and or controlled by Roman Catholics.
How long did you work for the agency?
I was in the pension plan, as they say, for just 25 months.
Eugene, Oregon is still on the line. Thanks for waiting. Go ahead, please.
This is Eugene, Oregon.
Yes, go ahead, please.
I wanted to comment and then a question. My comment is that Mr. MacMichael shows a rather definite anti-CIA bias based on his 25-month exposure. This always makes me leery of a person like the camel who gets outside the tent and then does his business back into the tent. I believe there's some bias there. It always makes me want to see the fellow's efficiency report and see what kind of action he had.
Well, we'll ask him about that. In the meantime, you might want to turn the volume down on your set so we can hear your question. But your response to his first comment?
Well, I have never attempted to portray myself as a professional CIA officer or employee. I had, as they say, 25 months working as a GS-14 senior estimates officer with the National Intelligence Council during the period that I mentioned. From time to time, both before and after that, I carried out under contract some activities, usually of a research nature, or always, as a matter of fact, of a research nature for the CIA, and various overseas assignments, usually under Department of Defense contract in Central America and in Southeast Asia. In the 1960s, I think I had ample opportunity to view and in some cases coordinate with certain agency activities, but as far as my so-called efficiency reports, can I say they're classified?
You have a follow-up, sir?
Yes. I just wanted to get on record that I don't believe the Alumni Association is typical of the ex-intelligence officer attitude. Second part, the substantive question as to he seems to be uncomfortable with the relative positions of the CIA versus the defense intelligence activities.
No, I'm certainly not uncomfortable with it. What I've tried to present here is what I regard as a very interesting evolution in which the Department of Defense and its various intelligence agencies, including the DIA and the Special Operations Command, are assuming a more and more powerful position within the intelligence community. And I think Mr. Colby referred to that in his remarks as the fact that you were going to run up against a very tough and determined Secretary of Defense Richard Cheney. Yeah, that's true.
Long Island, New York. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm wondering if the gentleman could comment as to whether or not really the American people are in a position whereby they would know whether or not there were sinister, secret, conspiratorial, powerful groups dominating our government, and their past and present actions could be hidden.
Well, you know, you're getting into one of the perennially popular areas for speculation, and I think it goes without saying that in any society, in any community, there is an establishment. That is true. You know, whether these groups, which at various times seem to exercise inordinate influence in the government, or represent, in fact, sinister conspiracies, or merely well-organized economic or social interests, which are characteristic of what politics is all about. And some of them, in fact, do try to operate behind the scenes. That's why in the city of Washington there are very large numbers of lobbyists who get very well paid to contact people for these purposes. Is certainly an ongoing question, but I'm not prepared with any knowledge I have to say that there is you know, such a conspiracy and that it is effective and is controlling. I have a good deal of faith in the people of the United States, and I think that the political system which we have and the sources of information which are available to people and which they can apply through that political system would militate against the, let us say, the permanent establishment of such a conspiracy in this country.
Madison, Wisconsin. Good afternoon.
Hello. You commented earlier on the relationship between covert activities and drugs, like dogs and fleas.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like you to comment on some information that had come out after the Iran-Contra hearings, in which John Hull in Costa Rica was indicted for murder, illegal drug trafficking, and gun running in Costa Rica. And this is where the CIA, well, he doesn't admit he's a CIA informant, but he's supposedly, this is where the guns and or money and drugs, whatever, were brought in by the CIA for money for the Contras. I'd like you to comment on that.
Yeah, well, Mr. John Hull's story is an interesting one, and in fact, he has stated publicly that he is a CIA asset. In his case, he was declares that he was receiving up to $10,000 a month to repay him for the use of his ranch in northern Costa Rica for various activities involving the supply of the Contra forces. And it is also true, as you say, that the Costa Rican government has under its system effectively indicted him, charged him with international drug trafficking, and has asked for his extradition from the United States. This request for extradition was made, I think, almost a year ago at this point, and it seems to be proceeding in a very snail-like manner. I think there are very strong elements in the Costa Rican government, at least my friends there tell me this, who are not really too serious or wanting him there, because it involves a lot of Costa Rican politicians as well. And the United States government has given every indication over the years of wishing to give maximum protection to Mr. Hull. This is a story that is yet to be fully told, but there is a lot there, and it's by way of being a small scandal, yeah.
Our preview of the Robert Gates confirmation hearings will continue until the top of the hour, and Dave MacMichael will be here for about 14 more minutes to take more of your calls. Walnut, California. Go ahead, please.
Yes, this is Susan Amaya. Hi. My question is, what is the relationship or difference between the CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy?
When the National Endowment for Democracy was legislated into existence in 1983, congressional testimony and statements on the floor at that time was that this would allow the United States now to do overtly the sort of political intervention which the CIA had been doing covertly. And in fact, one can only say, you know, democracy is a good thing, and National Endowment for Democracy is a good thing. One questions, though, whether, let us say, the United States would submit with good grace to a foreign nation's organizing an endowment to come into the United States and expend large sums of money in our electoral contests. As a matter of fact, it's prohibited by law here, but we do use this in other countries. The NED has been used in Panama, in the Philippines, in Nicaragua. There's a large plan for its operations now in Angola and the planned elections there. But I hesitate to say that the relationships are official or close. But I think, in a case in which I know reasonably well, the Nicaraguan elections of 1990, that the action in terms of support for the candidates the United States favored was very closely coordinated with the covert activities undertaken by the CIA over a number of years.
Any connection, though, between the NAD and some of the people who run that endowment?
Oh yeah, as a matter of fact,
CIA?
you can check into the backgrounds of people who have been. The NED works through contractors. It's composed of, the National Endowment's board is composed of the foreign policy branches of both the Republican and the Democratic parties, the Foreign Institute of the AFL-CIO, and a similar body of the United States Chamber of Commerce. And the contracts which they award to through the appropriations from Congress, the people who have received these, not infrequently, have been associated with, in fact, our former United States intelligence employees. This is not to say that once they leave that employ, they're not free to use their foreign expertise to seek contracts. But this sort of thing does arouse the sort of suspicion and comment which the caller indicates, and it happens to be a matter of fact.
New York City. Good afternoon.
Hello. I sat through 4 days of the Thomas confirmation hearings, and I'm looking forward now to the confirmation hearings for Robert Gates. And after watching the Sunday morning shows today with David Boren saying that it is very plausible that Robert Gates did not know about what was going on with Iran-Contra, one thing that came to my mind, and it's making me somewhat angry, is what if it happened to common sense? Is there no common sense in the American public to, yes, anything is perhaps plausible, but the idea that this man who is so intricately involved with the CIA did not have awareness or knowledge of what was going on around him? And going just back to the analogy with Clarence Thomas, the idea that these senators spent 4 days discussing the abortion and whether or not he talked about it or even thought about it, common sense would tell you that he had. So why do we waste so much time? Will the senators just basically protect the Washington establishment and cover up, so to speak, for someone like Gates and Thomas, or just use common sense and say, if I'm going to be true to my own intelligence and not insult myself as well as the American people, I will have...
Caller, I'm just going to stop you. We get your point. Thank you for calling, but your reaction to what she had to say.
Well, my reaction is very similar to hers. These matters were gone over with Mr. Gates in 1987, and frankly, so many doubts were raised about his credibility, his competence, as a result of that he withdrew his nomination. Now here it comes again, as someone used to say, and certainly more information has come out since then, which indicates that if Mr. Gates were not more aware than he has admitted to be, then one really has to question his competence. And I think, as the caller indicates, that common sense would say that is so. And many critics of Mr. Gates, including those from within the agency, Thomas Polgar, for one, have made very strong statements saying that to give to Mr. Gates after the events of Iran-Contra and his role, or at least his lack of diligence and vigilance while he was in a position to exercise control, been such that to put him into the position of the Director of Central Intelligence would be very damaging to the morale of the intelligence community, and would give a very bad signal as to how one succeeds in the intelligence business.
Portland, Oregon. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. With the communist Soviets having admitted that there are 400 KGB agents in this country, not knowing who they are, don't you think that we should have a better informed CIA and give them all the support we can?
Well, caller, the responsibility for KGB agents in the United States belongs to the FBI and its counterintelligence activities, and in fact, they do get a very significant budget by the estimate of the Federation of American Science on this in their recent bulletin. The FBI counterintelligence will get at least $300 million for their activities this year.
Another 5 minutes or so with your phone calls. Woodbridge, Virginia.
Yes, I have a question relative to a book that was published in 1989 by William Corson and the cooperative with Susan and Joseph Trento.
Widows.
In that book, they make allegations that the former director of counterintelligence, Angleton, as a result of an investigation by Agent Claire Petty, was in fact named as a mole for the Soviet intelligence service, dating back to his relationships with Kim Philby in the 30s.
Well, the relationships, in fact, were in the 50s with Kim Philby, but Mr. Angleton's career was so bizarre, the man himself so strange, if I may use a euphemism here, that one of the great scandals, I think, of the CIA is that under three successive directors, Allen Dulles, John McCone, and Richard Helms, this man, who by the estimate of the chief psychologist of the CIA itself was a dangerous paranoid, was permitted to hold the position as long as he did. We commented on that earlier. There's an excellent book on Mr. Angleton by Tom Mangold, published last year, called Cold Warrior. Worth reading.
Very quickly, how did we get information before the CIA? What kind of operations did the U.S. have?
Well, I think the point made by Mr. Colby is accurate, that the United States did not have a well-organized intelligence system. But the information, and that's a term I prefer to intelligence, by the way, the information that we got came principally from our embassies abroad and the military attaches thereat. And I can tell you very frankly that the work even before that, particularly dealing with the Soviet Union, that was organized by George Kennan and others, was first-class stuff.
Washington, D.C., good evening.
Good evening. How are you doing tonight? I was just hearing a previous caller from New York who said that the senators should almost take a reality pill and just sort of assume that Mr. Gates knew about this problem with the Iran-Contra hearing and then go from there. And I want to know, is there a single shred of evidence that Mr. Gates knew about Iran-Contra that could stand up in a U.S. courtroom? Now, I'm looking here at the Washington Post today, and it says a script for Mr. Gates to be used with the House chairman, but it doesn't say he was given the script. And I've heard the people below him knew about it, and the people above him knew it, but it doesn't say Mr. Gates knew about it. Is there, and I'm asking you on your knowledge of this issue, is there a single shred of evidence that would say definitively Mr. Gates knew?
Well, of course, when you narrow it down to definitively like that, of course, it's impossible to give an unambiguous answer. But I can tell you this: that if you will go to the transcript of the hearings held on Mr. Gates in 1987, when he was first nominated for this post, and you will go to this transcript of his appearance before the Senate Intelligence Committee to testify to what he knew about this, I think you will find a great deal of evidence indicating the high probability that he did. Now, whether in a U.S. courtroom, if this were in front of a jury, the weight of this evidence would be sufficient to carry a verdict, I'm not prepared to say. But don't talk about no shreds of evidence. There is plenty of evidence. It's much more than a shred, and I'm afraid a lot of the evidence has been shredded.
We have time for one more caller, Los Angeles, California. Good evening.
Hello. Yes, wonder if you could just go back over who has access to the CIA and how that could be opened up more.
Well, I don't know what really mean by who has access to the CIA. Is the CIA's reporting, of course, goes out to a great number of officials, particularly in the executive branch. There's a widespread distribution list for this sort of reporting. The Congress, of course, gets periodically its reports in front of the select committees on intelligence, and as far as other access goes, with some difficulty, but it is still possible. You can use the Freedom of Information Act, and the average citizen can get a certain amount of information. But I will tell you this, that one of the worst flaws of the Central Intelligence Agency has been an excessive secrecy. Just last year, the very distinguished Professor Warren Cohn resigned, as did most of his colleagues from the State Department's review board for the Foreign Relations Series, because of the total refusal of the CIA to give up documents now 35 and more years old in countries like Iran and Guatemala, where major activities were carried out by the CIA. And as Professor Cohen said, this amounts to a fraud on history. This is a problem.
Will Robert Gates get confirmed?
I do not believe. I'm going to go out on the limb on this when I say I do not believe Mr. Gates will be confirmed. No.
David MacMichael, the Washington director of the Association